My name is Levi Brennan, and I own a grain mill in Nebraska. 3 weeks ago, the zombie outbreak hit our small farming community like a tidal wave. I watched my neighbors turn into flesh-eating monsters while I barricaded myself inside my family's century-old mill. The thick stone walls that protected 4 generations of Brennans became my fortress against the undead hordes. What started as a few infected stumbling down Highway 6 became a siege that nearly cost me everything. This is how I survived the first 3 weeks when the world ended. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from. In the comment section below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. The Brennan family mill has been standing on this patch of Nebraska farmland since 1892. My great-grandfather Seamus built these walls thick enough to survive prairie tornadoes, blizzards, and whatever else Mother Nature could throw at them. He used to tell my grandfather stories about why he made the foundation so deep, why he chose this particular hill, why every stone was placed just so. I never thought those old stories would save my life. I'm the 4th generation to run this mill. Levi Brennan, though most folks around here just call me Mill. Been grinding wheat and corn for the farming families in this part of Nebraska since I was 18 years old. Took over the business completely when my father passed 6 years ago. Every morning I'd wake up in the apartment above the mill, fire up the old diesel generator, and get ready for another day of turning grain into flour, cornmeal, and feed. The mill sits about 15 miles southeast of Lincoln, right off Highway 6. From my office window on the 2nd floor, I can see clear across the Platte River Valley in 3 directions. Great-grandfather chose this spot because the elevation gives you a perfect view of anyone coming down the road, whether they're bringing grain to be processed or just passing through. He always said a man should know who's coming to visit before they know he's watching. My typical day started before sunrise. I'd check the weather, review my orders from the local farmers, and make sure all the machinery was running smooth. The mill processes about 2,000 pounds of grain on a busy day. We serve maybe 40 farming families in a 50-mile radius. These are people whose grandfathers did business with my grandfather. Trust runs deep in farm country. The work is precise. You can't just throw grain into the grinding stones and hope for the best. Different types of wheat need different settings. Corn requires its own adjustments. The moisture content has to be just right, or you'll ruin the batch. I learned these details from my father, who learned them from his father, who learned them from Seamus himself. 4 generations of knowledge passed down through hands-on teaching and countless hours of practice. The mill building itself is solid limestone, 2 stories tall with walls nearly 2 feet thick. The main grinding floor houses the original stone wheels, though we upgraded to steel rollers for most of the commercial work decades ago. The 2nd floor holds the grain storage bins and my small office. There's a loading dock on the east side, where farmers back up their trucks, and a smaller door on the west side that leads to the residential section where I live. Most people don't realize how isolated we are out here. The nearest neighbor is Tom Morrison, and his farmhouse sits almost a mile away across the cornfields. The Hendersons live another half-mile past Tom's place. When you're working the night shift cleaning equipment or catching up on paperwork, you might not see another human being for 12 hours straight. City folks would find the silence unsettling, but I've always found it peaceful. That peace started disappearing about a week before everything went to hell. It began with the radio reports. I keep a small transistor radio in the office, usually tuned to the agricultural report station. Instead of commodity prices and weather forecasts, we started hearing strange news from Chicago and Denver. Reports of people getting violently sick, hospitals overflowing, authorities recommending people stay indoors. The reporters kept calling it a flu outbreak, but their voices carried an edge I'd never heard before. The first sign something was seriously wrong came when Jake Patterson didn't show up for his weekly grain pickup. Jake runs cattle about 10 miles north of here, and he's been coming to the mill every Tuesday morning for 8 years straight. Never missed an appointment, never been late. Tuesday came and went. No Jake. Wednesday morning, I got a call from Sarah Chun, who runs the feed store in Milford. She asked if I'd heard from any of the farmers in our area. Half her regular customers hadn't placed their usual orders. The other half were calling to double or triple their feed purchases. People were either disappearing or panicking, and nobody seemed to know why. By Thursday, the radio reports were getting more specific and a lot more frightening. The illness wasn't responding to any known treatments. Infected people were becoming extremely aggressive, attacking medical staff and other patients. The government was establishing quarantine zones around major metropolitan areas. All commercial flights were grounded indefinitely. That afternoon, Tom Morrison drove over to the mill in his old Chevy pickup. Tom's in his 60s, been farming the same land his whole life. Steady as a rock, never gets rattled by anything. But when he climbed out of that truck, his hands were shaking and his face was pale as fresh flour. He needed cattle feed, he said. But he also needed to talk. Tom had driven into Lincoln that morning to pick up some equipment parts. What he saw there scared him worse than anything in 40 years of farming. Military vehicles setting up roadblocks. People loading their cars with everything they could carry. Stores with empty shelves and broken windows. Most disturbing of all, he'd seen people who looked sick wandering the streets aimlessly, seemingly unaware of the chaos around them. Tom asked me if I had enough supplies to last a few weeks without going into town. He suggested I might want to stock up on diesel fuel for the generator and any canned goods I could find. He was planning to do the same. Something bad was coming, he said, and rural folks needed to be ready to take care of themselves for a while. I took Tom's advice seriously. That evening, I drove into the little town of Milford and bought every gallon of diesel fuel they had. In stock, 55 gallons total. I also loaded up on canned foods, batteries, and basic medical supplies. The store clerk mentioned that several other farmers had been doing the same thing. Word was spreading through the rural community that we might be on our own soon. Friday morning brought more disturbing radio reports. The quarantine zones weren't containing the outbreak. Chicago was completely cut off from outside contact. Denver was reporting similar problems. The illness was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and the symptoms were unlike anything medical professionals had seen before. Around noon, I spotted something unusual through the office window. A steady stream of vehicles was moving east on Highway 6, away from Lincoln. Cars loaded with luggage, pickup trucks pulling trailers, even a few RVs and motorcycles. More traffic than our quiet road usually sees in a month. These weren't locals. These were city people running from something. The stream of refugees continued through Friday night and into Saturday morning. I counted over 100 vehicles in 24 hours. Some stopped at Tom's place, probably asking for directions or supplies. A few even turned up my driveway, but I wasn't taking any chances with strangers. I'd learned enough from the radio to know that panicked people can be dangerous, especially when they're desperate. Saturday afternoon, the radio stations out of Lincoln went silent. 1 minute they were broadcasting emergency instructions about staying indoors and avoiding contact with infected individuals. The next minute, nothing but static. I tried other frequencies, picking up scattered reports from Omaha and Kansas City, but the news was all bad. The outbreak was spreading exponentially. Military units were being overwhelmed. Government officials were evacuating to secure locations. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I started preparing the mill for a siege. Great-grandfather Seamus had built this place during tough times. The 1890s brought economic depression, severe weather, and plenty of uncertainty to Nebraska farming communities. He designed the mill not just to process grain, but to serve as a fortress if necessary. The thick stone walls weren't just for show. The elevated position wasn't just for the view. The deep foundation wasn't just for stability. I spent Saturday evening going through every room in the mill, taking inventory of everything that might be useful for survival. The grain storage. Bins on the second floor held about 3,000 pounds of wheat and corn. Not processed into flour or meal yet, but that could be done by hand if the electric equipment failed. There were basic tools in the workshop, including hammers, crowbars, and a chainsaw with extra fuel. The residential section where I lived was modest but well stocked. My kitchen pantry held enough canned goods and dry staples for maybe 2 weeks. The apartment had its own water line connected to the deep well that served the mill operation. Most importantly, the backup diesel generator could power essential systems for days if I used fuel carefully. Sunday morning brought an eerie quiet. No more refugee traffic on Highway 6. No sounds of farm equipment from the neighboring properties. Even the usual Sunday morning church bells from Milford were silent. The only noise came from my generator and the distant sound of wind through the corn stalks. I spent the day checking every potential entry point into the mill. The main delivery door was solid oak, but I reinforced it with 2x12 planks from the workshop. The smaller residential door got the same treatment. Every ground floor window was boarded up from the inside, leaving just small gaps for observation. The second floor windows were too high to reach from ground level, but I prepared materials to board them up quickly if needed. The most important discovery came when I was moving grain sacks in the basement. Behind a stack of 50-pound wheat bags, I found a heavy wooden door I'd never noticed before. It led to a small room carved directly into the bedrock beneath the mill. Great-grandfather's emergency storage room. Inside were supplies that had been waiting there for over a century. Canned goods with dates from the 1930s, bottles of water, medical supplies, even a small cache of ammunition for hunting rifles. There was also a handwritten journal wrapped in oiled leather. Great-grandfather's emergency protocols. Page after page of instructions for surviving extended isolation, rationing supplies, and defending the mill from hostile forces. He'd lived through the economic collapse of the 1890s, the harsh winter of 1899, and the drought years of the early 1900s. This man had thought through every possible scenario that might threaten his families. Survival. One entry particularly caught my attention. Seamus wrote about the importance of controlling noise and light during dangerous times. The mill's elevated position made it visible for miles, but that could be either an advantage or a liability depending on the circumstances. He'd installed shutters on all the windows and planned multiple escape routes through the grain chutes that connected different levels of the building. Sunday night, I tested the generator's sound levels from various distances. The diesel engine was loud enough to be heard from Tom's farmhouse on a quiet night. That might not matter if Tom was still around, but it would definitely attract attention from anyone else in the area. I made a mental note to run the generator only when absolutely necessary. I also climbed up to the roof to check the sight lines in all directions. From the mill's peak, I could see at least 5 miles in every direction when the weather was clear. The grain elevator tower gave me an even better view, though it would be dangerous to access during any kind of emergency. Still, that elevated position might be crucial for spotting threats before they got close. Monday morning changed everything. I was checking grain moisture levels in the storage bins when I heard Tom Morrison's truck coming up my driveway. Nothing unusual about that. Tom often stopped by early in the week to discuss feed orders or share news from town. But when I looked out the window, something was wrong with the way he was driving. The truck was weaving slightly, moving slower than normal, like Tom was having trouble controlling it. The truck came to a stop near the loading dock, but Tom didn't get out right away. He just sat there behind the wheel for several minutes. When he finally opened the door, I could see that something was seriously wrong. His clothes were torn and dirty. His face was pale and covered with sweat. He moved with the unsteady gait of a man who was either very sick or very drunk. I called down to him from the second-floor window, asking if he was all right. Tom looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood turn cold. The friendly neighbor I'd known for years was gone. In his place was something that looked like Tom Morrison, but moved and stared like a wild animal. Tom didn't answer my question. Instead, he started walking toward the mill's main entrance with that same unsteady gait. His arms hung loose at his sides, and his head tilted at an odd angle. When he reached the door, he didn't knock or call out. He just started pushing against it with his shoulder, like he was trying to break it down. I called out to him again, louder this time, asking what was wrong and telling him the door was locked. Tom's only response was to push harder against the door. Then he started making sounds I'd never heard from a human being before. Low groaning noises like an animal in pain. That's when I realized Tom Morrison was infected with whatever had been spreading through the cities. And he wasn't here for a friendly visit. I watched from the window as Tom continued his assault on the door. The heavy oak held firm, but I could see him becoming more aggressive. He started hitting the door with his fists, leaving bloody smears on the wood. The groaning sounds got louder and more frequent. This wasn't the behavior of a sick man. This was something else. Entirely. After about 10 minutes of futile attacks on the main door, Tom wandered around to the west side of the building. I followed his progress through different windows, watching as he tested the residential entrance, pushed against boarded-up windows, and even tried to climb up the loading dock ramp. Nothing seemed to satisfy him except the desire to get inside the mill where I was hiding. The most disturbing part was how persistent he was. A normal person would have given up after a few minutes of unsuccessful attempts. Tom kept circling the building, trying different approaches, never seeming to tire or lose interest. It was like he could sense my presence and was determined to reach me no matter how long it took. Around midday, Tom finally wandered away from the mill. I watched through the second-floor window as he walked across the cornfields toward his own farmhouse. His gait was still unsteady, but he moved with purpose, like he was following some instinct I couldn't understand. 20 minutes later, I heard screaming from the direction of Tom's property. The screams came in short bursts, high-pitched and terrified. A woman's voice. Tom's wife, Margaret. I'd known Margaret Morrison for 15 years. She sang in the church choir and organized the annual Harvest Festival. She was one of the kindest people in our community. And now she was screaming like someone was murdering her. The screaming lasted maybe 2 minutes, then silence. I spent the rest of that afternoon watching Tom's farmhouse through binoculars, but I couldn't see any movement. No sign of Tom or Margaret. Just an empty yard and a house with all the curtains drawn. Whatever had happened over there, I knew it wasn't good. As evening approached, I made final preparations for what I was now certain would be a long siege. I moved all essential supplies to the second floor, where they'd be harder for intruders to reach. I filled every available container with water from the well, just in case the pump system failed. I organized weapons within easy reach of my sleeping area. A hunting rifle, a shotgun, and various tools that could serve as weapons if necessary. Most importantly, I established a watch schedule for myself. Every 2 hours, I would check all approaches to the mill through different windows. I would monitor the radio for any emergency broadcasts. I would test essential systems like the generator and water pump. I would record everything in a journal, following great-grandfather Seamus's example. The sun set on Monday evening with no sign of Tom or Margaret Morrison. No traffic on Highway 6, no sounds from neighboring farms. Just the steady hum of my generator and the rustling of corn stalks in the autumn breeze. I was settling in for my first night of formal watch duty when I saw them. Dark shapes moving across the cornfields from the direction of Lincoln. Too far away to make out details, but definitely human figures walking east along Highway 6. At first I counted maybe 6 or 7 individuals, all moving in the same direction, all walking with that same unsteady gait I'd observed in Tom Morrison. Over the course of 2 hours, the number grew. More shapes appeared on the highway, some coming from side roads, others emerging from farm properties. By 10 o'clock that night, I counted at least 20 figures moving past the mill. None of them turned up my driveway, but several paused at the base of the hill like they were considering it. I turned off all the lights and shut down the generator. The mill fell into complete darkness and silence. From my second-floor observation post, I watched the infected individuals continue their eastward migration. Whatever was drawing them in that direction, it was stronger than their apparent interest in my location. By midnight, the migration had stopped. Highway 6 was empty again. But I knew this was just the beginning. If Tom Morrison could become infected, anyone could. If people from Lincoln were wandering the countryside in groups, the outbreak was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. And if my isolated mill was attracting their attention, I was going to need every advantage great-grandfather Seamus had built into this place. I spent the rest of the night reviewing his emergency journal and planning my survival strategy. The thick stone walls would protect me from anything short of explosives. The elevated position gave me clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. The grain supplies could sustain me for months if rationed carefully. The deep well provided reliable water as long as the pump kept working. But I also understood the challenges ahead. I was completely alone with no way to communicate with other survivors. My generator fuel would only last so long. The infected seemed drawn to this area for reasons I didn't understand. And winter was coming to Nebraska, which would bring its own set of survival problems. As dawn broke on Tuesday morning, I realized my old life was over. The quiet mill owner who processed grain for friendly farming families was gone. In his place was someone who would need to think like a soldier, plan like a strategist, and fight like his life depended on it. Because it did. Tuesday morning brought my first real test of great-grandfather Seamus's fortress design. I woke before sunrise to the sound of footsteps on gravel. Not the purposeful stride of a farmer coming to do business. These were shuffling, uneven steps that seemed to circle the mill without any clear destination. From my second-floor window, I counted 5 infected individuals wandering around the base of the hill. They moved with that same disturbing gait I'd seen in Tom Morrison, arms hanging loose, heads tilted at unnatural angles. 2 of them I recognized as refugees who'd passed through on Highway 6 just days earlier. A middle-aged woman in a torn business suit and a young man wearing a collared sweatshirt. The other 3 were strangers, but their clothes suggested they'd come from Lincoln or one of the suburban areas. What struck me most was how they seemed drawn to the mill without any obvious reason. They weren't responding to light or sound since I'd kept everything dark and quiet since midnight. Yet they kept circling the building, occasionally pressing their hands against the stone walls or pushing against the boarded windows. It was like they could sense something inside that attracted them. I spent an hour watching their behavior patterns through different windows. They didn't communicate with each other or show any signs of coordination. Each one seemed to follow its own instincts, but those instincts all led them to test every possible entry point into the mill. The main door, the loading dock, the residential entrance, even the high windows on the second floor that were clearly beyond their reach. Around 7 in the morning, they began to lose interest and wander away. But I noticed something troubling. Before leaving, each infected individual spent several minutes standing at the base of the hill, facing the mill, almost like they were memorizing its location. That suggested a level of awareness that made my skin crawl. The rest of Tuesday, I focused on strengthening my defenses and organizing supplies more efficiently. Great-grandfather's emergency journal contained detailed diagrams of the mill's construction, including several features I'd never known existed: hidden compartments in the stone walls, reinforced anchor points for barricades, even a system of pulleys and counterweights that could seal off the grain chutes from the inside. Most interesting was his notation about the mill's foundation. Seamus had built it with multiple levels of defense in mind. The main floor was designed to be abandoned if necessary, with all vital supplies moved to the second floor. The second floor could be sealed off completely using heavy oak beams that slotted into hidden brackets in the walls. And if even that position became untenable, the basement storage room could serve as a final refuge. I tested these systems throughout the day, learning how to activate the various defensive measures quickly and quietly. The oak beams were heavier than I'd expected, requiring careful leverage to maneuver into position. The grain chute seals worked smoothly despite their age, but they made more noise than I was comfortable with. The pulleys needed oil to operate silently. While making these preparations, I also established a more systematic approach to rationing supplies. The 3,000 pounds of grain in the storage bins could be processed by hand using the old stone grinding wheels, though it would be slow work. Properly managed, that grain could provide basic nutrition for several months. The canned goods from both my kitchen and great-grandfather's cache would add variety and essential vitamins. Water was my biggest advantage. The deep well that served the mill had been drilled in the 1880s and had never run dry, even during the worst drought years. The electric pump could draw water as long as the generator ran, but Seamus had also installed a manual backup system that could be operated by hand. I tested both systems and found them working perfectly. The generator situation was more challenging. 55 gallons of diesel fuel would keep the engine running continuously for about 10 days. But continuous operation would mean constant noise, which would attract every infected individual within miles. I needed to find a balance between maintaining essential systems and staying hidden. I spent Tuesday afternoon experimenting with generator schedules. Running it for 2 hours every 6 hours provided enough power to pump water, charge the radio batteries, and run minimal lighting. The noise periods were short enough that infected individuals might not have time to track the source before the engine shut down again. Wednesday brought my first serious test of these defensive preparations. I was processing a small batch of wheat using the hand-operated stone wheels when I spotted movement on Highway 6. A larger group this time, maybe 15 infected individuals, moving in a loose formation toward the mill. Unlike the previous day's random wanderers, these seemed to have a specific destination in mind. They turned up my driveway without hesitation and began climbing the hill with more purpose than I'd seen before. Within minutes, they were testing every barricaded entrance just like the earlier group, but with greater persistence. They pushed harder against the doors. They clawed more aggressively at the boarded windows. And they made more noise doing it. The groaning sounds were constant now, a low chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to communicate frustration and hunger. Occasionally one of them would let out a sharper cry, almost like they were calling to others. I couldn't tell if these were random vocalizations or some form of primitive communication. What worried me most was their coordination. Without any apparent signals, they began working together to test weak points in my defenses. 3 of them focused on the main door, while others circled the loading dock. 2 climbed onto the lower roof sections, trying to reach second-floor windows. They seemed to understand that multiple simultaneous attacks might succeed where individual efforts failed. I realized this was exactly the scenario great-grandfather Seamus had planned for. Time to activate the mill's primary defensive systems. Moving quickly but quietly, I sealed the grain chutes using the pulley system. Then I positioned the heavy oak beams to block access from the main floor to the second level. These preparations took nearly an hour, during which the infected continued their assault on the building's exterior. The sounds of their attacks were getting louder and more frequent. Once the second floor was secured, I established my primary defensive position in the grain storage area. From there, I had clear sight lines through small observation windows to all approaches to the mill. The stone walls were thickest at this level, and the elevation gave me significant tactical advantages. Most importantly, I had access to all essential supplies without having to venture into potentially compromised areas. The siege lasted 14 hours. Throughout Wednesday afternoon and into the evening, the infected maintained their assault on the mill's defenses. They never seemed to tire or lose interest. When one approach failed, they tried another. When individual efforts proved unsuccessful, they attempted group attacks. They were learning, adapting, becoming more effective with each attempt. Around sunset, they discovered the loading dock's hinges were slightly loose from years of heavy use. 4 of them began working together, pushing and pulling in rhythm, trying to break the metal fasteners. The oak planks I'd used to reinforce the door held firm, but the hinges themselves were starting to show stress. That's when I made my first tactical mistake. Worried about the loading dock's integrity, I fired a single rifle shot through one of the observation windows. The bullet struck the infected woman in the business suit, dropping her immediately. The others scattered briefly, giving the door hinges a temporary reprieve, but within minutes they were back. And now they knew exactly where I was hiding. The remaining infected focused all their attention on the second floor. They stacked debris to reach higher windows. They found handholds in the stone walls that I hadn't known existed. 2 of them even managed to climb onto the mill's main roof, where they spent hours trying to break through the slate tiles. I realized I'd revealed my position for a very temporary advantage. The loading dock was still compromised, the infected were now targeting my stronghold directly, and I'd wasted precious ammunition on a threat that was immediately replaced by others. This was a learning moment that probably saved my life in later encounters. Never reveal your position unless absolutely necessary. Never waste ammunition on single targets when facing multiple threats. And never assume that eliminating one infected will discourage the others. Wednesday night was the longest night of my life up to that point. The infected never stopped their assault on the mill. They worked in shifts without any apparent coordination, some focusing on the ground floor, while others tested the second floor defenses. The sounds they made were constant and disturbing. Groaning, scraping, occasional sharp cries that seemed to express frustration or determination. I couldn't sleep with that constant noise and the knowledge that my defenses were being tested every minute. Instead, I maintained watch through different observation windows, tracking their movements and noting any changes in their behavior patterns. I also continued reading great-grandfather's journal, looking for insights that might help me survive the current situation. One entry particularly stood out. Seamus wrote about the importance of patience during extended sieges. He'd apparently faced hostile groups before, though he never specified whether they were human threats or something else. His advice was to let attackers exhaust themselves against prepared defenses rather than engaging actively. Save ammunition for critical moments. Preserve energy for the long term. Trust the fortress to do its job. Thursday morning brought a welcome change. As the sun rose, the infected gradually lost interest in the mill and began wandering away. By 10 o'clock, only 3 remained, and they seemed less focused than the night before. An hour later, the area around the mill was completely clear. I spent Thursday assessing the damage and reinforcing weak points that had been revealed during the siege. The loading dock hinges needed immediate attention. Several ground floor windows showed stress damage from constant pressure. And I'd noticed that some of the mortar between stone blocks was older and softer than the rest, creating potential handholds for climbers. But I also felt encouraged by how well great-grandfather's defensive design had performed. The thick walls had held firm against everything the infected could throw at them. The second-floor stronghold had proven completely secure. And the supply systems had functioned perfectly throughout the crisis. Most importantly, I was beginning to understand infected behavior patterns. They were drawn to the mill by something I couldn't identify, but their attacks followed predictable routines. They tested the same weak points repeatedly. They lost interest when their efforts showed no progress. And they seemed less active during daylight hours. Thursday afternoon brought another crucial discovery. While reinforcing the loading dock hinges, I found evidence that previous generations had faced similar threats. Hidden behind a loose stone in the wall, I discovered a small metal box containing documents from the 1930s. Great-grandfather had apparently faced some kind of siege during the Dust Bowl years, though his notes were cryptic about the exact nature of the threat. References to the hungry ones and night wanderers, and those who lost their way in the storms. More useful were his tactical observations. Notes about infected behavior during different weather conditions. Strategies for conserving ammunition during extended sieges. Methods for creating noise distractions to draw attackers away from the mill. And most intriguingly, references to other survivors who had successfully defended rural strongholds during whatever crisis he'd experienced. The documents included a hand-drawn map showing the locations of other fortified positions within a 50-mile radius. Grain elevators, water towers, stone bridges, and even some farmhouses that had been specifically reinforced for defense. If any of these locations were still viable, I might not be as alone as I'd thought. But first, I needed to deal with more immediate concerns. The radio had been picking up increasingly desperate transmissions from surrounding areas. Omaha was reporting complete breakdown of civil authority. Kansas City had gone silent entirely. And closer to home, there were scattered calls for help from rural areas that suggested the infection was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. Friday brought the largest group yet. I counted 23 infected individuals approaching the mill from multiple directions. They weren't traveling together, but they all arrived within a 2-hour period, almost like they were responding to some kind of signal I couldn't detect. The group included people of all ages, from teenagers to elderly individuals, all showing the same symptoms of infection. This time I was better prepared. I'd spent Thursday evening setting up what great-grandfather called diversion stations around the mill's perimeter. Piles of metal objects that could be knocked over to create noise in different directions. Reflective surfaces that could be used to redirect sunlight. Even some basic tripwires that would cause infected individuals to stumble and potentially injure themselves. The siege began at dawn and immediately proved more challenging than Wednesday's attack. This larger group showed better coordination and more persistence. They divided their attention between multiple targets, preventing me from focusing defenses on any single weak point. They also seemed to learn from the previous group's failures, avoiding tactics that had proven unsuccessful. Most concerning was their apparent ability to communicate. I observed several instances where one infected individual would make specific vocalizations that caused others to change their behavior. Not complex communication, but definitely some form of information sharing. This suggested a level of retained intelligence that made them far more dangerous than mindless monsters. The Friday siege lasted 18 hours and tested every defensive system great-grandfather had built into the mill. They broke through the first layer of barriers around the loading dock. They found ways to climb higher on the stone walls than I'd thought possible. And they discovered ventilation openings that I'd completely overlooked during my initial security survey. But the core defenses held firm. The second-floor stronghold remained secure. Essential systems continued operating. And I was able to repel the most serious threats without wasting ammunition or revealing additional information about my capabilities. Saturday morning brought both relief and a disturbing realization. The infected had withdrawn again, but they'd left clear evidence of their presence around the mill. Handprints on windows, scratches in the stone walls, and most troubling, what looked like primitive markers made from sticks and stones arranged in patterns around the hill's base. I spent Saturday studying these markers through binoculars, trying to understand their purpose. They might have been random arrangements created by infected individuals with damaged minds, but they looked too deliberate, too purposeful. More like territorial markings or navigation aids that could guide future attacks. That afternoon, while reinforcing defenses based on lessons learned during the Friday siege, I made another important discovery. Great-grandfather's journal contained detailed instructions for a defensive tactic he called the Grand Diversion. It involved using the mill's grain processing equipment to create massive noise and dust clouds that would confuse and scatter attacking groups. The technique required precise timing and significant risk. I would need to activate the main grinding stones using stored grain, creating both audible and visual distractions on a scale that would attract infected from miles around. But if executed properly, the confusion might allow me to eliminate multiple threats simultaneously or create opportunities for tactical repositioning. Reading between the lines of his notes, I suspected great-grandfather had used this technique successfully at least once. His descriptions were too detailed and confident to be purely theoretical. But he'd also written warnings about using it only as a last resort, when all other defensive options had been exhausted. Saturday evening brought another test of my defensive preparations, but this time with a crucial difference. Only 7 infected approached the mill, but they moved with more purpose and coordination than any previous group. They went directly to the weak points revealed during earlier attacks. They worked together without apparent signals, and they showed what I can only describe as tactical thinking. This smaller group accomplished more in 3 hours than the larger groups had managed in much longer periods. They partially breached the loading dock barrier. They found a route to the second-floor windows that I'd thought impossible. And they came uncomfortably close to discovering the ventilation system that supplied fresh air to my stronghold. I realized I was facing an evolution in the infected population. Either they were retaining more intelligence than I'd initially believed, or successful tactics were somehow being passed between groups. Either possibility meant that my defensive advantages were temporary. The infected were learning faster than I was adapting. Sunday brought the most frightening development yet. No infected approached the mill at all. After 6 days of constant siege activity, the sudden absence of threats was more disturbing than their presence had been. I spent the day conducting reconnaissance through binoculars, trying to understand where they'd gone and why they'd stopped coming. What I saw through those lenses changed my entire understanding of the situation. The infected weren't gone. They were gathering. Across the valley, in the area around Tom Morrison's farmhouse, I could see groups of infected individuals converging from multiple directions. Not the random wandering I'd observed before, but purposeful movement toward a specific location. By Sunday evening, I estimated at least 50 infected had gathered in that area, with more arriving hourly. They were forming some kind of camp or staging area. And based on the direction they kept looking, I was pretty sure I knew what their next target would be. The mill had survived its first week of siege warfare, but I realized this was just the beginning. The infected were organizing, learning, preparing for something much larger than the random attacks I'd faced so far. Great-grandfather's fortress had proven its worth against small groups, but I was about to face a test that would require every advantage he'd built into this place. As Sunday night fell, I began preparations for what I was certain would be the real battle for survival. The infected had spent a week probing my defenses, identifying weak points and developing tactics. Now they were massing for a coordinated assault that would either prove the mill's defenses adequate or expose me to threats I wasn't prepared to handle. I spent that night reviewing every page of great-grandfather's journal, looking for insights that might help me survive what was coming. His experiences during the 1930s had clearly been different from what I was facing, but the principles of defensive strategy remained the same: patience, preparation, and faith in the fortress he'd built. But as I watched torchlight flickering in the distance where the infected were gathering, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to face something beyond even Seamus Brennan's considerable foresight. Monday morning revealed the true scope of what I was facing. Through my binoculars, I counted over 80 infected individuals gathered around Tom Morrison's property. They weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They had organized into distinct groups, each focused on different activities. Some were stripping materials from abandoned buildings. Others were testing routes between the farmhouse and my mill. A few seemed to be stationed as sentries, watching the approaches to their makeshift camp. This level of organization terrified me more than anything I'd witnessed during the first week. These weren't mindless zombies driven purely by hunger. They were displaying tactical thinking, division of labor, and long-term planning. Whatever infection had taken their humanity, it hadn't completely destroyed their ability to reason and coordinate. I spent Monday morning studying their behavior patterns through the mill's observation windows. The infected groups rotated activities every few hours, suggesting some form of leadership or instinctual hierarchy. They also showed clear signs of reconnaissance work, sending small teams to probe different approaches to my position before returning to report their findings. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to modify the environment to suit their needs. They were using farm equipment and building materials to create barriers around their camp. They'd established what looked like supply caches in strategic locations, and they were systematically destroying anything that might provide advantage to potential enemies, including cutting phone lines and blocking rural roads. The radio situation had deteriorated significantly over the weekend. Most commercial stations were broadcasting either emergency announcements on loop or nothing at all. The few live transmissions I could pick up painted a picture of complete societal collapse. Military units were withdrawing to predetermined strongholds. Government officials had evacuated to secure locations. Emergency services had ceased functioning in most areas. One transmission particularly caught my attention. A ham radio operator calling himself Delta 7 was broadcasting from somewhere near Omaha, reporting that rural areas were experiencing rapid increases in infected populations. His theory was that the infected were being driven out of urban areas by military action and seeking easier targets in farming communities. He estimated that within 2 weeks, every rural property within 100 miles of a major city would face organized attacks. Delta 7 also provided tactical intelligence that proved invaluable. According to his observations, infected groups showed increased activity during cooler temperatures, particularly in early morning and late evening hours. They were drawn to consistent noise sources but could be confused by multiple simultaneous sounds from different directions. And most importantly, they seemed to lose coordination and become more vulnerable during severe weather conditions. This last piece of information made me pay closer attention to weather forecasts. October in Nebraska typically brought at least one major storm system, often accompanied by high winds, heavy rain, and dramatic temperature drops. If Delta 7 was correct, such conditions might provide opportunities to break up the infected, gathering before they could launch a coordinated assault on the mill. Tuesday brought the first direct contact between the infected groups and my defensive perimeter. Around mid-morning, I observed a team of 6 infected individuals moving systematically up the hill toward the mill. Unlike previous random attacks, this group showed clear signs of advanced planning. They approached from the northwest, using the grain elevator's shadow to conceal their movement. They carried improvised tools made from farm equipment. And they moved in a coordinated formation that suggested specific roles for each member. I watched through the observation windows as they conducted what could only be described as a professional reconnaissance mission. They tested every defensive barrier I'd constructed, but they didn't attempt to breach them. Instead, they seemed to be measuring, evaluating, gathering intelligence for future use. One infected individual even appeared to be making marks in the dirt, possibly creating a map of my defenses. The reconnaissance team spent 3 hours conducting their survey before withdrawing to the main group. But they left behind evidence of their visit that chilled me to the bone. Carefully arranged stones that marked the locations of weak points in my defenses, scratches in the ground that indicated optimal approach routes, and most disturbing, what looked like a crude timer made from sticks and leaves, suggesting they were planning their assault for a specific time. That afternoon, I made the decision to activate some of great-grandfather Seamus's more aggressive defensive measures. His journal described a system of exterior hazards designed to discourage prolonged siege attempts. These included concealed pits around the mill's perimeter, tripwires connected to noisemakers, and even some basic explosive devices using materials from the old quarry operations. Seamus had apparently used these measures during the 1930s crisis with significant success in disrupting organized attacks. I spent Tuesday afternoon and evening preparing these defensive systems. The concealed pits were relatively simple, requiring only strategic placement of weak coverings over holes dug near likely approach routes. The tripwires were more complex, involving pulleys and counterweights that would activate various distractions when disturbed. The explosive devices were beyond my expertise, but I found detailed instructions and pre-positioned materials that made them manageable. Most importantly, I established what Seamus called fallback positions throughout the mill complex. If the main stronghold on the second floor became untenable, I could retreat to the basement storage room. If that position was compromised, there was an emergency tunnel that led to the old storm cellar 50 yards from the main building. And if even that refuge failed, there were escape routes through the grain elevator system that could get me to the river bottom. Wednesday morning brought the assault I'd been dreading. The attack began before dawn with systematic probing of my outer defenses. The infected had learned from their reconnaissance mission and knew exactly where to focus their efforts. They approached in 3 separate groups, each targeting different weak points simultaneously. This coordinated approach meant I couldn't concentrate my defensive efforts on any single threat. The Northwest group triggered several of my tripwire systems, creating noise and confusion that temporarily disrupted their advance. But they adapted quickly, using the activated traps to identify safe approach routes for the other groups. The Southeast team found a path up the hill that avoided most of my defensive measures entirely. And the group approaching from the main road seemed to have detailed knowledge of the mill's layout, moving directly toward access points that weren't visible from their starting position. I realized that the infected had been gathering intelligence about my position for much longer than I'd suspected. They knew details about the mill's construction that should have been impossible to observe from a distance. This suggested either enhanced sensory capabilities or the presence of individuals who had visited the mill before becoming infected. The first major breach occurred around 8 in the morning, when the Southeast group successfully forced open a basement access door that I'd thought was completely secure. The door had been hidden behind grain storage equipment and wasn't visible from any of my observation windows. Yet they went directly to it, suggesting insider knowledge of the mill's layout. I was forced to abandon the second-floor stronghold and retreat to the basement storage room much earlier than I'd planned. This tactical withdrawal cut me off from most of my supplies and limited my ability to monitor the overall situation. I could hear the infected moving through the main floors above me, but I couldn't see what they were doing or how many had gained entry to the building. From the basement storage room, I activated the most extreme defensive measure great-grandfather had prepared for such circumstances. The mill's grain processing equipment could be overloaded to create massive amounts of flour dust in the air. When ignited, this dust would create devastating explosions throughout the building. Seamus had designed this system as a last resort, capable of destroying the mill entirely if necessary to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But using the flour dust system required precise timing and significant personal risk. I would need to activate the grinding equipment, wait for sufficient dust accumulation, then create an ignition source while ensuring my own escape through the emergency tunnel. Too early, and the explosion wouldn't be effective. Too late, and I might not survive the blast. Wednesday afternoon became a deadly game of timing and positioning. The infected had occupied the main floors of the mill and were systematically searching for my location. I could hear them moving overhead, testing floors and walls, looking for hidden passages or secret rooms. They were being methodical and thorough, suggesting they knew I was still inside the building. Somewhere, around 3 in the afternoon, they found the entrance to the basement storage room. The heavy wooden door that had protected great-grandfather's emergency supplies for over 90 years began showing stress as infected individuals attacked it with improvised tools. The door was solid oak reinforced with iron bands, but it wasn't designed to withstand prolonged assault by multiple attackers working in coordination. I had perhaps an hour before they broke through. Time enough to activate the flour dust system if I moved quickly. But once I triggered that sequence, there would be no turning back. The explosion would destroy everything my family had built. Over 4 generations, the mill that had served the farming community for over a century would become a crater in the Nebraska countryside. As the attacks on the storage room door intensified, I made the hardest decision of my life up to that point. I activated the grain processing equipment using the manual controls Seamus had installed for exactly this situation. The grinding stones began turning, processing the wheat and corn stored in the overhead bins. Within minutes, fine flour dust began filling the air throughout the mill's interior spaces. The infected individuals attacking my door seemed confused by the sudden noise and activity, but they didn't abandon their assault. If anything, they became more aggressive perhaps. Sensing that time was running out, I had perhaps 20 minutes before the dust concentration reached explosive levels. Time enough to gather essential supplies and reach the emergency tunnel. But I also faced a terrible choice about timing the ignition. Too soon, and some infected might survive to continue their assault. Too late, and I might not escape the blast. Radius. The emergency tunnel was exactly as great-grandfather had described it in his journal. A narrow passage carved through bedrock, leading from the storage room to the old storm cellar beyond the mill's foundation. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person and required crawling for most of its length. But it provided a secure escape route that the infected couldn't follow even if they discovered its entrance. I made the journey through that tunnel carrying only the most essential supplies. Great-grandfather's journal, basic medical supplies, a small amount of food and water, and one hunting rifle with limited ammunition. Everything else would be lost in the explosion, including the grain stores that could have sustained me for months. The storm cellar at the tunnel's end was a masterpiece of Depression-era engineering, built into a natural rise in the ground. It was completely invisible from the surface, but provided secure shelter with adequate ventilation. Seamus had stocked it with emergency supplies that remained viable after decades of storage. Water, preserved food, basic tools, and even some warm clothing suitable for extended outdoor survival. From the storm cellar's concealed observation port, I could see the mill and monitor the situation while remaining completely hidden. The infected had succeeded in breaking through the storage room door and were searching frantically for my location. They seemed to understand that I had been there recently, but couldn't determine where I'd gone. As the flour dust concentration built throughout the mill's interior, some of the infected began showing signs of respiratory distress. The fine particles were affecting their ability to breathe and see clearly. This created exactly the conditions great-grandfather had planned. For confused, disoriented attackers in an environment primed for devastating explosion. I waited until the dust cloud was so thick that infected individuals were stumbling blindly through the mill's corridors. Then I used a flare from the emergency supplies to create the ignition source. The explosion was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Even from the storm cellar, located 50 yards from the mill, the blast wave was powerful enough to shake dust from the ceiling and temporarily deafen me. The mill that had stood for over a century disappeared in a massive fireball that must have been visible for miles. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained of the main building except scattered stone blocks and twisted metal from the processing equipment. The grain elevator tower had toppled, creating a debris field that covered most of the hill. And most importantly, I counted at least 15 infected individuals who had been caught in the blast, their threat permanently eliminated. But my victory came at a devastating cost. The mill that had been my family's legacy for 4 generations was gone. The grain stores that could have sustained me through winter were destroyed. And my secure fortress had been reduced to rubble, leaving me exposed and vulnerable with winter approaching. From the storm cellar, I could see surviving infected individuals gathering around the destruction. They seemed confused and disoriented by the sudden loss of their target, but they weren't abandoning the area. If anything, the explosion seemed to have attracted more infected from surrounding areas, drawn by the noise and flames. Thursday morning brought a new reality that I was completely unprepared to handle. I was no longer the defender of a secure fortress. I was a refugee with limited supplies, winter approaching, and hostile forces controlling the area around my former stronghold. The storm cellar provided temporary shelter, but it wasn't designed for long-term habitation. The supplies great-grandfather had stored there would last perhaps 2 weeks with careful rationing. The concealed location offered security, but it also meant I couldn't monitor the broader situation or communicate with potential allies. Most challenging was the psychological impact of losing everything I'd worked to defend. The mill hadn't just been my home and livelihood. It had been a connection to my family's history, a symbol of stability in an increasingly chaotic world. Watching it disappear in flames felt like losing part of my identity. But great-grandfather's journal provided perspective that helped me cope with this devastating loss. Seamus had apparently faced similar choices during the 1930s crisis. His notes described the decision to sacrifice temporary security for long-term survival as the hardest lesson a defender must learn. Sometimes preservation means destruction. Sometimes you have to lose everything to save what matters most. Thursday afternoon, I began planning my next phase of survival. The storm cellar would serve as a base of operations, while I assessed the new situation and identified potential allies. The infected groups that had been gathering around Tom Morrison's property were now scattered and confused by the mill's destruction. This provided opportunities for movement and reconnaissance that hadn't existed during the siege. Most importantly, I remembered great-grandfather's map showing other fortified positions within a 50-mile radius. If any of those locations were still viable, I might find other survivors who could provide mutual support. The grain elevators, water towers, and reinforced farmhouses he'd marked might offer better long-term prospects than trying to rebuild defenses from scratch. But first, I needed to understand the current threat level and identify safe travel routes. The infected were still present in the area, but their organization had been disrupted by the mill's destruction. This might be my best opportunity to escape the immediate area and seek more secure shelter before winter weather made travel impossible. Friday brought the first sign that my situation might not be as hopeless as I'd feared. While conducting reconnaissance from the storm cellar's observation port, I spotted smoke rising from the direction of the Henderson farmhouse 3 miles to the east. Not the black smoke of destruction, but the controlled gray smoke of a chimney. Fire. Someone was alive over there, and they felt secure enough to risk revealing their location. The Hendersons were good people who'd done business with the mill for over 20 years. If they'd survived the initial outbreak and established defensible positions, they might welcome additional manpower for mutual protection. At minimum, they could provide information about conditions in other parts of the county. But reaching the Henderson place would require crossing 3 miles of open countryside while avoiding infected patrols. The direct route along the farm roads was too exposed. The alternative path through the cornfields would provide concealment, but also limit visibility of potential threats. Either approach carried significant risks. Friday evening, I made the decision to attempt contact with the Hendersons. The approaching winter weather meant that isolated survival would become increasingly difficult. My supplies from the storm cellar wouldn't last through the cold months, and the psychological isolation was already affecting my judgment and morale. I spent Friday night preparing for the journey. Essential supplies were reduced to what I could carry in a single backpack. Great-grandfather's journal and map were carefully protected in waterproof wrapping. The hunting rifle was cleaned and loaded with the last of my ammunition. Most importantly, I studied the terrain between the storm cellar and Henderson farmhouse, identifying landmarks and potential shelter points along the route. Saturday morning brought perfect conditions for the attempt. Heavy fog had settled across the valley, providing natural concealment for movement. The infected groups were less active during daylight hours, especially in cool, damp conditions. And the wind direction would carry any sounds I made away from known infected positions. I sealed the storm cellar carefully before leaving, preserving it as a potential fallback position if the journey failed. Great-grandfather's emergency refuge had served its purpose perfectly, providing security during the mill's destruction and a base for planning the next phase of survival. But it was time to seek better long-term prospects. The journey toward the Henderson farmhouse would test everything I'd learned about infected behavior, tactical movement, and survival psychology. But it also represented hope for finding other survivors and building the kind of mutual support networks that might allow human communities to survive this crisis. As I left the storm cellar and began moving through the fog-covered cornfields, I carried with me the lessons of the mill's siege and destruction. Great-grandfather Seamus had built more than just a fortress. He'd created a comprehensive survival system that could adapt to changing circumstances. The mill was gone, but the knowledge and principles that had guided its defense would serve me well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The infected had won the battle for the mill, but they hadn't won the war for survival. That fight was just beginning. The journey through the fog-covered cornfields took 3 hours of careful movement, but it revealed something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. The infected weren't randomly distributed across the countryside. They were following specific patterns, moving along established routes, almost like they were following invisible highways that connected different areas of interest. I counted 4 distinct groups during my trek toward the Henderson farmhouse. Each group consisted of 8 to 12 individuals, moving in loose formation with what appeared to be designated scouts ranging ahead of the main body. They weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were conducting systematic searches of rural properties, moving from one farm to the next in a logical sequence. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to communicate across distances. When one group discovered something of interest, they would emit specific vocalizations that were answered by other groups miles away. The responses weren't random groaning sounds. They were distinct calls that seemed to convey different types of information. Discovery calls, warning calls, gathering calls. This suggested a level of organization that extended far beyond the local groups I'd encountered at the mill. The infected were operating as part of a larger network, sharing intelligence and coordinating activities across the entire region. What I'd been thinking of as isolated attacks were actually components of a comprehensive strategy to eliminate human survivors from rural areas. The Henderson farmhouse came into view around 10 in the morning, and what I saw there gave me both hope and deep concern. The house showed clear signs of fortification. Windows were boarded with heavy planks. The front porch had been converted into a defensive position with firing ports cut through the walls. A perimeter of improvised barriers extended around the main buildings, creating multiple layers of defense. But I also noticed details that suggested the situation was more precarious than the chimney smoke had implied. The barriers showed recent damage that hadn't been repaired. Several outbuildings had been partially destroyed. And most troubling, I could see what looked like burial mounds in the pasture behind the house. I spent an hour observing the property before making contact. During that time, I saw movement in the house windows that confirmed living occupants. But I also noticed that their defensive positions were oriented primarily toward the main road, leaving potential blind spots that infected groups could exploit. The Hendersons had done good work fortifying their property, but they were making some of the same mistakes I'd made during the early stages of the mill's siege. My approach to the farmhouse required extreme caution. I needed to identify myself as a human survivor without triggering defensive fire from nervous defenders. The standard approach would be to call out from a distance, but that would also alert any infected in the area to my presence. I decided to use a technique great-grandfather's journal had mentioned for identifying friendly forces during crisis situations. I arranged stones in a specific pattern near the house's main approach route, then withdrew to observe the response. The pattern was an old farmer's signal that predated modern communication systems, something the Henderson family would recognize if they remembered their grandfather's stories. Within 20 minutes, I saw someone at the house rearrange the stones into a response pattern that confirmed safe contact. The reunion with Bill Henderson was emotional and informative. Bill had lost his wife Martha during the first week of the outbreak, but he'd managed to save his teenage grandson Kyle and a neighbor family named the Washingtons. 4 survivors total, holding a defensive position that had been under intermittent attack for over 2 weeks. Bill's account of the outbreak's progression filled in crucial gaps in my understanding. The infected had appeared in their area approximately 3 days after the first reports from Lincoln. Initially, they seemed to be random refugees fleeing urban areas, but within a week, their behavior had changed dramatically. They began coordinating attacks on isolated properties, systematically eliminating survivors who couldn't defend themselves effectively. Most valuable was Bill's information about other survivor groups in the region. He'd maintained radio contact with at least 6 other fortified positions within a 30-mile radius. A grain elevator near Seward was sheltering 12 survivors. The water tower in Pleasantdale housed a family of 5. Even the old stone bridge over Salt Creek had been occupied by a group of 8 people who'd turned it into a defensive position. But Bill also provided disturbing intelligence about the infected group's capabilities. They were learning from each successful attack, developing more effective tactics, and sharing that knowledge across the network. Properties that had successfully defended against initial assaults were being subjected to increasingly sophisticated siege techniques. The infected were evolving their strategies faster than the survivors could adapt their defenses. The weather forecast added urgency to our situation. A major storm system was approaching from the west, expected to bring heavy rain, high winds, and the first hard freeze of the season. According to Delta 7's radio broadcasts, severe weather conditions disrupted infected coordination, but also made defensive positions more vulnerable to infiltration. Bill's group had experienced this phenomenon during a thunderstorm the previous week. The infected had become disoriented and scattered during the worst weather, but individuals had managed to penetrate closer to the house than ever before. One had actually reached the front porch before being discovered and eliminated. We spent Saturday afternoon strengthening the Henderson farmhouse defenses and developing contingency plans for the approaching storm. The property had several advantages over the mill's position. Multiple buildings provided fallback positions if the main house was compromised. A barn filled with farm equipment offered both shelter and potential weapons. Most importantly, an old root cellar provided secure underground refuge that could shelter all 4 defenders if surface positions became untenable. But the farmhouse also had vulnerabilities that concerned me. The defensive perimeter was extensive, but difficult to monitor with only 4 people. The multiple buildings created dead zones where attackers could approach undetected. And the property's location in a valley bottom limited long-range visibility compared to the mill's elevated position. Kyle Henderson proved to be a valuable addition to our defensive capabilities. At 17, he'd adapted quickly to the new reality and showed natural aptitude for tactical thinking. He'd been maintaining watch schedules, monitoring radio communications, and even conducting reconnaissance missions to nearby properties. His youth and energy complemented the adult's experience and knowledge. The Washington family brought different strengths to our group. James Washington was a retired military mechanic who understood defensive engineering and equipment maintenance. His wife Carol was a former nurse with medical skills that could prove crucial during extended siege conditions. Their 10-year-old daughter, Amy, provided motivation for all of us to maintain hope and fight for a future worth preserving. Saturday evening brought the first test of our combined defensive capabilities. A reconnaissance team of 6 infected individuals approached the farmhouse from the northeast, using the same systematic tactics I'd observed during the mill's siege. But this time, we had sufficient personnel to monitor all approaches simultaneously and coordinate responses effectively. The infected team's behavior confirmed my growing understanding of their organizational capabilities. They weren't just probing our defenses randomly. They were testing specific weak points that had been identified during previous reconnaissance missions. Their approach routes avoided obvious defensive positions while targeting blind spots in our coverage. Most significantly, they seemed to be gathering intelligence for a larger assault rather than attempting immediate penetration. After 2 hours of careful observation and testing, they withdrew without making serious attack attempts. But they left behind the same types of markers I'd seen at the mill. Stones arranged to indicate defensive positions, scratches in the ground marking optimal approach routes, even what looked like timing devices made from organic materials. The approaching storm system arrived Sunday morning with dramatically deteriorating weather conditions. Heavy rain began before dawn, followed by steadily increasing winds that made observation difficult and communication nearly impossible. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours, creating the kind of conditions that Delta 7 had described as disruptive to infected coordination. But the storm also created new vulnerabilities for our defensive position. The rain turned dirt approaches into slippery mud that would slow any retreat to fallback positions. The wind noise masked the sounds of potential infiltration attempts. And the dramatic temperature change seemed to increase infected activity levels rather than reducing them as we'd hoped. Around noon on Sunday, we lost radio contact with 3 of the survivor groups Bill had been monitoring. The grain elevator near Seward went silent first, followed by the water tower position, and finally the Stone Bridge group. Their last transmissions described large numbers of infected converging on their positions during the worst weather conditions. This pattern suggested that the infected were using the storm as cover for coordinated assaults on multiple survivor positions simultaneously. Rather than being disrupted by severe weather, they seem to have adapted their tactics to take advantage of reduced visibility and communication difficulties. Sunday afternoon brought the assault we'd been dreading. The attack began with probing actions from multiple directions, designed to identify our current defensive capabilities and force us to reveal our positions. But unlike previous encounters, this assault showed clear signs of intelligence gathered from other survivor positions that had already fallen. The infected knew details about rural defensive tactics that they could only have learned by observing successful attacks elsewhere. They approached through the storm using concealment techniques that suggested retained tactical knowledge. Small groups moved independently toward different objectives, coordinating their actions without apparent direct communication. They avoided the defensive positions we'd prepared for frontal assault, instead targeting structural weak points that weren't obvious from external observation. The first breach occurred when a team of 4 infected individuals managed to penetrate the barn through a hayloft opening that we'd thought was too high to reach. They'd used farm equipment as improvised ladders, showing problem-solving capabilities that went far beyond mindless hunger. Once inside the barn, they began systematic destruction of stored supplies and equipment that could have sustained us. Through the winter, James Washington and I attempted to retake the barn while Bill and Kyle maintained defensive positions around the main house. But the infected had anticipated this response and used the barn infiltration as a diversion for attacks on the house itself. By the time we realized the deception, they'd gained access to the front porch and were attacking the reinforced front door with tools taken from the barn. The battle for the Henderson farmhouse lasted 8 hours and tested every defensive technique we'd developed. The infected showed tactical flexibility that adapted to our responses in real time. When we concentrated fire on one group, others would exploit the reduced coverage elsewhere. When we attempted to seal compromised positions, they would open new breaches using knowledge of the building's construction details. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to learn from casualties among their own forces. When one infected individual was eliminated while attempting a specific infiltration route, others would immediately avoid that approach and try alternative methods. This suggested either retained tactical intelligence or some form of information sharing that allowed them to benefit from others' failures. The turning point came when the storm's intensity peaked around 8 in the evening. Hurricane-force winds and torrential rain created conditions that disrupted both our defensive coordination and the infected's attack patterns. But rather than benefiting from this disruption, we found ourselves at a severe disadvantage. The infected seemed less affected by the extreme weather than we were. They continued their assault with undiminished intensity, while we struggled to maintain communication and coordination between defensive positions. The wind noise made it impossible to hear approaching threats. The rain reduced visibility to mere yards, and the cold was sapping our energy faster than we'd anticipated. That's when Carol Washington made the observation that probably saved our lives. She noticed that the infected individuals showed signs of impaired coordination during the most intense wind conditions. Not complete incapacitation, but reduced effectiveness in their tactical movements. They seemed to rely on sensory capabilities that were disrupted by extreme weather more than we'd realized. This insight led to our most desperate tactical decision. Rather than continuing to defend fixed positions that were being systematically compromised, we decided to abandon the surface buildings and retreat to the root cellar during the storm's peak intensity. The underground shelter would protect us from both the weather and infected assault while giving us time to develop new strategies. The retreat to the root cellar was accomplished under the worst possible conditions. Blinding rain, hurricane-force winds, and nearly freezing temperatures made movement extremely hazardous. But the same conditions that made our withdrawal difficult also concealed it from infected observation. By the time they realized we'd abandoned the surface positions, We were secure in the underground refuge. The root cellar proved to be even better prepared than great-grandfather's storm shelter. Bill's grandfather had apparently faced similar crisis during the Dust Bowl years and had stocked the cellar with supplies that remained viable decades later. Water, preserved food, medical supplies, and even weapons and ammunition that predated modern firearms. But most valuable was the discovery of another handwritten journal, this one belonging to Bill's grandfather during the 1930s. Crisis. The accounts were remarkably similar to great-grandfather Seamus's experiences, describing organized attacks by groups that weren't entirely human anymore. The terminology was different, but the tactical descriptions matched what we were facing almost exactly. Both journals referenced a network of rural survivors who'd successfully defended their positions through mutual support and shared intelligence. They'd established communication protocols, coordinated defensive strategies, and even conducted joint operations against hostile forces. Most importantly, they developed techniques for surviving extended underground shelter during the worst periods of conflict. Monday morning brought a transformed landscape above ground. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and dramatically colder temperatures. But it had also left evidence of the previous night's battle that showed how close we'd come to complete defeat. The farmhouse had been systematically destroyed. Every window was broken, every door had been torn from its hinges, and most of the interior had been ransacked. The barn was a total loss, with equipment and supplies scattered across the pasture. Even the defensive barriers we'd constructed had been methodically dismantled. But the infected were gone. The extreme weather had apparently disrupted their coordination enough to force a withdrawal. Through the root cellar's concealed observation port, I could see evidence of their retreat. Scattered debris that marked their path toward the main road. Abandonment of tools and materials they'd been using during the assault. Even what looked like casualties among their own forces who'd been overcome by the weather conditions. The radio traffic Monday morning painted a grim picture of the storm's impact on other survivor groups. Of the 6 positions Bill had been monitoring, only 2 were still broadcasting. The grain elevator group had been completely overrun during the storm. The water tower position was reporting severe casualties and requesting immediate assistance. The Stone Bridge group was no longer responding to calls. But there was also encouraging news from farther afield. Delta 7 reported that infected groups throughout the region had been disrupted by the storm system. Many had retreated to sheltered areas and were showing reduced activity levels. Some survivor positions that had been under constant siege were experiencing their first quiet periods in weeks. This suggested that severe weather conditions might provide strategic opportunities for survivor groups to regroup, resupply, and coordinate more effective defensive strategies. But it also meant that any advantages gained during storm conditions would be temporary. Once weather patterns normalized, the infected would resume their systematic elimination of human survivors. Tuesday brought a crucial decision point for our group. The Henderson farmhouse was no longer defensible. Our supplies had been severely depleted during the siege. Winter weather was approaching rapidly, and the infected groups in our area would certainly return once they'd recovered from the storm's disruption. We needed to find more secure shelter before the next assault, and we needed to establish contact with other survivor groups to coordinate mutual support. The root cellar could shelter us temporarily, but it wasn't suitable for extended winter habitation. We had perhaps a week to identify better alternatives before weather conditions made travel impossible. The solution came from studying both grandfather's journals and combining their intelligence about fortified positions in the region. Cross-referencing their maps revealed a location that both had marked as particularly defensible. An abandoned limestone quarry 15 miles south of our position, with natural caves that had been expanded during mining operations in the early 1900s. The quarry site offered several advantages over rural farmhouses or grain storage facilities. The limestone caves provided natural protection from weather and attack. The elevated position offered excellent visibility across the surrounding countryside. Most importantly, the quarry had multiple entrances and escape routes that would make it difficult for infected groups to conduct effective siege operations. But reaching the quarry would require crossing 15 miles of countryside that was now actively patrolled by infected groups. The direct route along established roads was completely compromised. Alternative paths through fields and woodlands would provide concealment, but also increase travel time and exposure to weather conditions. Wednesday morning, we made the decision to attempt the journey to the limestone quarry. The disruption caused by Monday's storm had created a window of opportunity that might not come again. Infected activity was still reduced throughout the region. Weather conditions were stable but cold enough to limit prolonged exposure. And our current position was becoming increasingly untenable with each passing day. The preparation for this journey required abandoning most of our remaining supplies in favor of mobility and stealth. Essential items were distributed among all group members to ensure survival if we became separated. Great-grandfather's journal and Bill's grandfather's records were carefully protected as our most valuable intelligence resources. Weapons and ammunition were allocated based on each person's capabilities and tactical role. Most importantly, we established communication protocols and rendezvous points in case the group became separated during travel. The limestone quarry was our primary objective, but the grandfather's journals identified several fallback positions that could provide temporary shelter if the main plan failed. As we prepared to leave the root cellar and begin the most dangerous journey any of U.S. had ever attempted, I reflected on how much had changed since the mill's destruction just 1 week earlier. I was no longer a solitary defender trying to preserve a family legacy. I was part of a survivor group working together to build something new from the ruins of the old world. The infected had destroyed our individual strongholds, but they'd also forced us to develop new approaches to survival that might prove more effective than isolated defense. The limestone quarry represented more than just another defensive position. It was the foundation for a different kind of human community, one that could adapt and thrive even in this transformed world. But first, we had to survive 15 miles of hostile territory while carrying everything we needed to start over. The journey ahead would test everything we'd learned about infected behavior, tactical movement, and group survival. Success would mean a chance to build something permanent. Failure would mean the end of human presence in this part of Nebraska. Thursday morning, we sealed the root cellar behind us and began moving south through the frozen cornfields toward our uncertain future. The journey to the limestone quarry began in the pre-dawn darkness of Thursday morning. With temperatures well below freezing and a thin layer of ice coating everything the storm had left behind. We moved in single file through the corn stubble, using the natural drainage ditches to stay below the sight lines of anyone or anything that might be watching the open countryside. James Washington took point, using his military experience to navigate and identify potential threats. Bill Henderson and I flanked young Amy Washington in the middle of our formation, while Kyle Henderson and Carol Washington covered our rear approach. This tactical arrangement allowed us to protect our most vulnerable members while maintaining defensive capabilities in all directions. The first 3 miles passed without incident, but they revealed disturbing evidence of how thoroughly the infected had been systematically clearing the rural areas. Every farmhouse we passed showed signs of recent assault. Broken windows, torn doors, scattered belongings that suggested hasty evacuations. Some properties showed evidence of successful defense followed by eventual overwhelming. Others had clearly fallen quickly to coordinated attacks. Most unsettling were the properties that showed no signs of struggle at all. These farmhouses appeared to have been simply abandoned, with belongings left in place as if the occupants had vanished without warning. James suggested these might represent instances where infected individuals had retained enough human appearance to infiltrate defensive positions through deception rather than force. Around mile 4, we encountered our first active threat since leaving the root cellar. A patrol of 8 infected individuals was conducting systematic searches of abandoned properties along our intended route. They moved with the same tactical coordination I'd observed during the mill's siege, dividing into smaller teams to cover more ground while maintaining communication through their distinctive vocalizations. We took shelter in an old grain bin while the patrol passed, but their behavior during the search provided valuable intelligence about their current operational methods. They were no longer just seeking survivors to eliminate. They were collecting specific materials and supplies, suggesting logistical planning for extended operations. Tools, preserved food, warm clothing, even fuel containers were being gathered and transported towards some central location. This organized scavenging operation implied a level of strategic thinking that went beyond tactical coordination during attacks. The infected were planning for sustained operations through winter conditions. They were building supply caches and establishing base camps. Most troubling, they seemed to be preparing for a prolonged campaign to eliminate human survivors from the entire region. By mid-morning, we'd covered 6 miles and were approaching the most dangerous section of our journey. The route ahead required crossing 2 major roads that served as primary travel corridors for infected patrols. Intelligence from both grandfathers. Journals suggested these roads had been compromised even during the 1930s crisis, requiring careful timing and coordination to cross safely. The first road crossing revealed how much the infected had learned about controlling territory. They'd established what could only be described as checkpoints at strategic locations, with permanent guards stationed to monitor traffic and respond to incursions. These weren't random patrols anymore. They were organized border controls designed to prevent survivor movement between defended areas. We waited 4 hours for a gap in their coverage before attempting the crossing. During that time, I counted over 30 infected individuals moving along the road in both directions. Some traveled in organized groups with apparent destinations and purposes. Others moved individually but followed established patterns that suggested routine assignments or patrol schedules. Most significantly, several groups were transporting materials and supplies using improvised vehicles and equipment. Farm trailers loaded with scavenged goods, wheelbarrows filled with tools and weapons, even some motorized equipment that suggested they'd either retained mechanical knowledge or learned to operate machinery through trial and error. The successful crossing of the first major road brought us to the halfway point of our journey, but it also revealed intelligence that changed our understanding of the threat we were facing. The infected weren't just an unorganized plague that would eventually burn itself out. They were building infrastructure for permanent occupation of rural areas. They were establishing territorial control and resource management systems. They were creating a new kind of civilization built on the elimination of human survivors. The implications were staggering. If this pattern was being repeated throughout the region, human survivors would face not just immediate threats, but systematic siege campaigns designed to eliminate every pocket of resistance. The infected had evolved from individual predators to organized, occupying forces with strategic objectives and long-term operational capabilities. Mile 8 brought us to terrain that offered better concealment, but also increased risks from environmental hazards. A stretch of dense woodland provided cover from observation, but limited our ability to detect approaching threats. The frozen ground made movement noisy despite our efforts at stealth, and the cold was beginning to affect our youngest and oldest group members more severely than anticipated. Amy Washington was showing early signs of hypothermia, despite the warm clothing we'd salvaged from the Henderson farmhouse. Her small body was losing heat faster than she could generate it, and the physical exertion of the journey was depleting her energy reserves. Carol was managing her daughter's condition with the skills of a trained nurse, but we needed shelter and warmth within the next few hours or Amy's situation would become critical. Bill Henderson was facing different, but equally serious challenges. At 62, he was struggling with the physical demands of cross-country movement while carrying essential supplies. His breathing was becoming labored, and he was showing signs of joint problems that would only worsen if we couldn't find secure shelter soon. The group's pace was being limited by the capabilities of our most vulnerable members. Around mile 9, we discovered evidence that other survivor groups had attempted similar journeys with mixed results. A scattered campsite in a small clearing showed signs of hasty abandonment. Supplies dropped during rapid retreat. Personal belongings left behind by people who'd been forced to prioritize speed over possessions. Most disturbing, drag marks in the frozen earth that suggested some members of the group hadn't escaped whatever had forced their retreat. James conducted a careful examination of the abandoned campsite, while the rest of us maintained security watch. His assessment painted a grim picture of what had happened there. The survivor group had been larger than ours, possibly 8 to 10 people including children. They'd been traveling with more supplies than we were carrying, suggesting a planned relocation rather than emergency evacuation. But they'd been discovered and attacked during what should have been a secure rest period. The attack had come from multiple directions simultaneously, indicating the same coordinated tactics we'd faced at the Henderson farmhouse. But the evidence also suggested that some members of the group had escaped the initial assault. Personal items were distributed along multiple escape routes leading away from the campsite. This meant other survivors might still be operating in the area, though whether as organized groups or scattered individuals was impossible to determine. Mile 10 brought us to the second major road crossing, and the situation there was significantly more challenging than the first checkpoint. The infected had established what appeared to be a permanent installation with multiple guard positions and overlapping fields of observation. Getting past this barrier would require either a significant detour that would add hours to our journey, or a direct confrontation that could compromise our mission entirely. Kyle Henderson volunteered to conduct reconnaissance of the checkpoint, while the rest of us took shelter in an abandoned farm building. His youth and agility made him the logical choice for this dangerous mission, but sending a 17-year-old into potential combat situations violated every instinct I had about protecting the next generation. The reality of our situation was that survival required using every advantage available, regardless of age or traditional protective instincts. Kyle's reconnaissance revealed both opportunities and additional complications. The checkpoint was indeed heavily defended, but the infected guards showed predictable patrol patterns that created brief windows for crossing. More concerning was evidence that they were stopping and examining everything that passed through their position. This wasn't just traffic control. They were conducting detailed inspections that suggested intelligence gathering about survivor movements and capabilities. The crossing attempt had to be perfectly timed to exploit a 15-minute gap between patrol rotations. We would have a single opportunity to move the entire group across the exposed road surface and into concealing terrain on the far side. Failure would mean either immediate confrontation with superior numbers or scattered retreat that could separate our group permanently. The successful crossing of the second checkpoint marked our entry into the final phase of the journey, but it also brought us into territory that showed signs of recent major conflict. The landscape was scarred with evidence of large-scale battles between survivor groups and infected forces. Burned buildings, defensive barriers that had been overrun, and scattered equipment from both sides painted a picture of escalating warfare. Mile 12 revealed the remains of what had once been a substantial survivor stronghold. A farm complex. had been converted into an impressive fortress with multiple defensive lines, underground shelters, and coordinated fields of fire. But the position had eventually been overwhelmed by what must have been a massive assault involving hundreds of infected attackers working in perfect coordination. James's examination of the battlefield provided sobering lessons about the infected's evolving capabilities. They'd used siege tactics that demonstrated engineering knowledge and strategic planning, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, systematic destruction of defensive positions, even what appeared to be the use of captured human equipment and weapons against the defenders. Most disturbing were signs that the infected had taken prisoners during the final assault. Improvised restraints and transportation devices suggested that some survivors had been captured alive rather than simply eliminated. This raised terrifying questions about the infected's intentions and capabilities. Were they simply eliminating human resistance, or were they developing more complex objectives that required living captives? Mile 13 brought us within sight of our destination, and the limestone quarry appeared even more defensible than the grandfather's journals had suggested. The excavation had created a natural amphitheater surrounded by high stone walls with limited access points. Multiple cave entrances provided shelter and storage opportunities. Most importantly, the elevated position offered commanding views of all approach routes for miles in every direction. But the quarry also showed signs of recent occupation. Smoke stains around cave entrances suggested fires had been maintained there recently. Scattered debris indicated human habitation within the past few weeks. Tool marks on the stone walls showed evidence of defensive preparations and structural modifications. The question was whether this recent occupation represented friends or enemies. Other survivor groups might have reached the quarry ahead of us and established defensive positions. But it was equally possible that infected forces had discovered the location and were using it as a base for their own operations. Approaching without intelligence could mean walking into either salvation or annihilation. Kyle volunteered for another reconnaissance mission, this one potentially more dangerous than the checkpoint surveillance. The quarry's layout provided excellent defensive advantages but also created perfect conditions for ambush. Anyone controlling the high ground around the excavation could eliminate approaching threats with minimal risk to themselves. 2 hours of careful observation revealed both encouraging and concerning intelligence about the quarry's current status. The site was indeed occupied, but by human survivors rather than infected forces. Sentries posted at strategic locations showed discipline and tactical awareness that infected individuals hadn't demonstrated. Smoke from carefully concealed fires suggested people who understood operational security. Most encouraging, response to Kyle's carefully staged approach signals followed protocols that indicated organized survivor groups rather than random refugees. The contact with the quarry's defenders revealed that our destination had become a regional rally point for survivor groups throughout the area. 18 people from 4 different locations had converged there over the past 2 weeks, creating the largest concentration of human resistance in a 50-mile radius. They'd established defensive positions, organized supply systems, and even maintained radio contact with other survivor enclaves, farther from the infected's primary areas of operation. Most valuable was their intelligence about infected activities throughout the region. The quarry group had been monitoring enemy movements and had identified patterns that confirmed our worst fears about their organizational capabilities. The infected were conducting coordinated campaigns to eliminate all human presence from rural areas. They'd established territorial boundaries and resource extraction operations. Most troubling, they were showing signs of technological adaptation that suggested retained human knowledge was being applied to their strategic objectives. The integration of our group into the quarry community required careful negotiation and mutual assessment of capabilities and intentions. Resources were limited, defensive responsibilities needed to be shared, and decision-making authority had to be established among people who'd never worked together before. But the alternative was continued isolation and almost certain elimination by increasingly organized infected forces. Over the following days, the quarry developed into something unprecedented in my experience since the outbreak began. A functioning, human community that could provide mutual support, shared defense, and coordinated planning for long-term survival. The limestone caves offered secure shelter from both weather and attack. Natural springs provided reliable water supplies, and the defensive position was strong enough to withstand anything short of overwhelming assault by massive infected forces. But perhaps most importantly, the quarry community represented hope for the future of human civilization in this transformed world. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were building something new. The knowledge and skills of 22 individuals from diverse backgrounds created capabilities that none of us could have achieved alone. Farmers, mechanics, medical professionals, teachers, and even a grain miller working together toward common objectives. The radio contact with other survivor communities revealed that similar rally points were being established throughout the region. The limestone quarry was part of a growing network of human resistance that spanned multiple states. Information was being shared about infected activities, successful defensive techniques, and resource locations. Coordinated operations were being planned to rescue isolated survivors and establish new strongholds. Most encouraging was intelligence about seasonal patterns and infected behavior. Several communities reported that the approaching winter weather was affecting infected coordination and activity levels more severely than initial observations had suggested. Extended periods of cold and snow seemed to force them into dormant states that could provide opportunities for human expansion and consolidation. The weeks that followed our arrival at the quarry taught me that the destruction of the mill hadn't been the end of my family's legacy. It had been the beginning of something larger and more important. Great-grandfather Seamus's knowledge about defensive strategy and survival planning was being shared with the entire community. His techniques were being adapted and improved through collaboration with other survivors who brought their own expertise and experience. The grain storage and processing knowledge that had been my family's specialty for 4 generations became crucial for the quarry community's food security planning. The techniques for evaluating and preserving grain stores, the understanding of nutritional requirements during extended isolation, and the skills for hand processing grain into usable food products were all essential for long-term survival. But more than technical knowledge, great-grandfather's journals provided philosophical guidance about the relationship between individual survival and community building. His experiences during the 1930s had taught him that isolated defense was ultimately doomed to failure. Sustainable survival required cooperation, mutual support, and shared sacrifice for common objectives. As winter deepened around the limestone quarry, I realized that the first 3 weeks of the zombie outbreak had indeed ended. But they'd ended not with defeat or surrender, but with transformation. The mill owner who'd barricaded himself against the collapse of the old world had become part of a community building something new from the ruins. The infected still controlled most of the territory around us. They continued their systematic elimination of isolated survivors. They maintained their organizational capabilities and strategic coordination. But they hadn't succeeded in destroying human civilization entirely. In places like the limestone quarry, communities of survivors were proving that adaptation and cooperation could overcome even the most overwhelming threats. The radio broadcasts that reached us from other survivor communities painted a picture of emerging human resistance throughout the region. Not just isolated defensive positions holding out against inevitable defeat, but organized networks working toward reconquest and reconstruction. The infected had won the initial battles, but the war for humanity's future was far from over. The seeds great-grandfather Seamus had taught me to value weren't just agricultural varieties that could feed communities. They were the ideas and values and knowledge that could grow into new forms of human civilization adapted to this changed world. The mill was gone, but the principles that had guided its construction and defense were being planted in new ground where they could flourish and spread. As I shared this story with you, I wanted you to understand that survival isn't just about defending what you have. Sometimes it's about losing everything and discovering what you can build from what remains. The infected destroyed my family's mill, but they gave me something more valuable in return. They gave me a community, a purpose, and hope for the future. The limestone quarry still stands today, months after those first 3 weeks that changed everything. The community has grown to over 60 people. We've established contact with survivor networks across multiple states. We've even begun planning expeditions to reclaim territory from infected control and rescue survivors who are still trapped in isolated positions. The knowledge I gained during those 3 weeks, the lessons from great-grandfather's journal, and the experience of building community from the ashes of the old world have become the foundation for something larger than anything my family had. Created in 4 generations of running a grain mill, we're not just surviving the zombie apocalypse anymore. We're building the future that will come after it.